Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my tutorial for covering basics of watercolor paint. Let's talk about watercolor paints. They come in a variety of options, but the main two options are either tube paints, so paint that comes in a tube, or what is called pan paints. These are like little hard candies, and you can buy them individually. They come wrapped like that. When you take all the packaging off, you have these little blocks of paint, and they typically get inserted into wells, and then your wells get put into your palette. This obviously is a hard consistency, and you need to use more water and brush stroking to activate it. Paint that comes in tubes has more of the consistency of toothpaste, so it's a little bit juicier and easier to activate and paint with. Of course, once a tube paint has been in your palette for a little while, it also will get hard. For example, this is tube paint that I squoze out into my well, and you can see it's pretty hard as well. So it's still, I would say, easier to activate than these that come in the pan. But there are also some other formats. For example, these are watercolor markers. There are also watercolor pencils. They act as regular markers, and then one side is narrow, one side is thicker, and then when you go over them with a watercolor brush full of water, they start to sort of melt and have that watercolor look. I don't really ever use these. The same is true of watercolor pencils. I tend not to use them. Also, paint can come in these sheets, which is an interesting delivery system. And these are intense pigment sheets, and you activate them with some water, and then you can paint with them. These were sent to me by a company in India, and there's quite a bit of variety. I think that they're really portable, so if you don't want to take a lot of supplies with you, these would be great for maybe a sketching option. Again, I don't use these that often. This is even a wilder option. This is powder, and you can either put water on your paper and sprinkle the powder on it, or you can sprinkle the powder and then put the water on there. And this is very unpredictable. It's an explosion of color. They're fun. Not something I use regularly. This is a new to me paint. It is somewhat between the tube and the pan paint, and these are made in the US. Their big push is that they are very environmentally friendly, so they don't come with a lot of plastic wrapping or paper wrapping or hard shells. In fact, they're even wrapped in wax paper, so very environmentally friendly. The colors are beautiful. This company is called Beam, if you want to look them up. There are a lot of great brands of paint out there. These are Winsor Newton, which is a British brand. Really beautiful colors as well. And these are Winsor Newton markers. I also have Winsor Newton watercolor pencils, but by far my favorite are the Daniel Smith tube paints. So let's look a little bit at palettes. So once we have our paints, we need to arrange our palettes. There are a lot of options for palettes, as you can imagine. You can go really small. This is my smallest palette. I really enjoy painting with this. You can buy these already pre-filled, or like I do, I buy them empty. They come with their little wells. There's a magnet in there. The wells are metal, and I fill them up with my own colors. This would be the mixing area, and this is what I use for my sketchbook adventures. So I know this doesn't look like a lot of paint, but you don't need a lot of paint for watercolors. And I have taken this on 6-week trips and painted every single day and not run out of paint. So this is a great option. You can't really tell the colors that you'll get from them just by looking at them in the palette. So I always make a little cheat sheet for myself of swatches of the colors I have in here. You can go with a slightly bigger palette as well. It's the same idea. This is another metal palette. And these I filled up with these pan paints. So these just pop in here. And again, I made my little swatches. Because I like to paint big, I like palettes that have bigger wells than the ones I just showed you. Other options are you can get plates like this, or even just a regular white dinner plate, and fill it up with the colors you're using for a specific painting. Just squeeze out your color into them. This is your mixing area. This is a great way to go. A lot of people make their own palettes, so you can get candies that come in little tins. And then I just filled up these little plastic wells with tube paint, and then I just have them taped to the tin. Looking at bigger palettes, this is the one that I have used for probably 10 or 15 years. I am really partial to palettes that are round like this, that allow me to put all of my colors in the order of the color wheel. And that's something that I get into in other classes where I really talk a lot about color theory. But let me just suffice to say that there is a lot of ease and intuition that comes to organizing your colors in a sensible way. When I first started painting, I would just squeeze out my colors randomly as I bought them. They would just go in the next well. And I found that really difficult to color mix with intuition or making good choices. This particular palette is plastic, so it's lightweight, especially if you're going to travel with it. This is Jack Richardson. It's a Quiller palette. It measures 14 3/4 by 14 3/4 inches, so it takes up some space on your table. It has 24 wells, and then in the side pockets there are 2, 4, 6, 8. So the majority of my wells are the ones that are circular, and I tend to put in all of the colors that I use the most. These colors have come from tubes, and you can tell I squeeze the whole tube into my palette. There's no reason not to. I know sometimes people like to just squeeze a little dab, but I find that that's just frustrating in the middle of a painting. You'll run out of paint, and then you have to go rifling through your supplies to find the paint to squeeze it out and start anew. And in the meantime, your painting is drying as you're futzing around like that. Unlike acrylic paint, when watercolor paint dries up, you can still activate it. So it doesn't dry out, get hard, and then need to be tossed. Some of these colors have been in here for over a year, and they're just fine. What I do recommend is spraying them down with water about 10 minutes before you start painting. This helps them start to activate, sort of waking them up, and it'll make painting easier when you get your brushes wet and you get in here and you start activating them with your brush and your water. They'll already have softened. So I recommend spraying them, and then once you start painting, it'll be an easier job for you. Some of them, I'm letting them run pretty low because I have switched to a different palette. But like I said, I've used this one for a good 15 years, and it has served me really well. I'll show you. So this is my Hansa Yellow Light. I want to squeeze some more into this well, but you can see that that well has a lot of orange mixed in with that yellow. And honestly, yellow gets dirty so easily that it's hard to keep it clean. My suggestion for cleaning out your paints is to do it when they have dried and you have just barely sprayed a little bit of water on them. With that little bit of water, and I can spray a little bit more on my Kleenex, then I can get in here and wipe away that red paint. And then I'm not taking away a lot of paint from that. If you try to clean it up when you've been painting for an hour and it's really juicy and wet, you'll find that when you put your Kleenex in it, you're going to lift out half of the paint that you have in there, and that's a lot of wasted paint. So better to let it dry out, barely spray it, and then that's clean enough. And then I just open up my tube paint and squeeze it out. And I have found that with these particular wells, they're quite large. I can squeeze almost an entire tube into them. And like I said, you don't need a lot of paint when you're painting, but I like big wells because I can get in there with big brushes to paint the bigger surface areas that I like to paint. And let me set this aside and then just show you the palette I have recently switched to. And I don't recommend this to beginners because I think it can be really overwhelming. But over the years, I have collected a lot of colors and they could not fit in the palette I just showed you. So I recently bought this Robox palette. I absolutely love it. The other palette I just showed you holds 32 colors total. This holds 61. It has a really small mixing area, but it does come with extra mixing areas when you buy it. It also comes with a little carousel so you can spin it as you're painting. And I really have been enjoying this quite a bit. Like I said, I don't think you should go this deep into it until you've been painting for a while. In fact, I recommend starting off painting with a really limited palette of colors. A cool, a warm, and a neutral yellow, a cool, a warm, and a neutral red, and a cool and a warm and a neutral blue. And more about that later. But just for the fun of it, I wanted to share with you activating some of these paints and just seeing what they do for us. So this is a little bit of watercolor paper. And let's get a brush going. So we can start with the ones that I'll set aside pretty quickly just because I don't really paint with these, but these are the markers. That's the thick side. This is the thin side. Look at the difference between that because one is depositing so much more pigment than the other. That's the difference between the thick end and the thinner end. And then you can get in there with a wet brush and you can see it really is watercolor pigment. I don't know that I would ever paint paintings with these. They were a gift, but I think that they might be really enjoyable and convenient to use when you go out sketching. You wouldn't even need to bring water or brushes. You could just do all your painting with the markers and then add the water when you get back home. So that's one way to play with those. Then we have these pigment sheets. And one thing that's really interesting is how the pigment that shows up here is not really the color that you end up painting with. So it gives you legends down here of which colors you're looking at. It's important to get to know those if you use these. And again, I would never really do a painting in my studio with these, but it is fun to play with when you're out and about. So a wet brush, and look at that color. These colors are so vibrant and really vivacious. I've had a lot of fun just playing around with these. And in watercolors, if you want a color to be lighter, you just add more water to it. So I can add more water to my paper and really make these lighter. You don't have to paint that vibrant. We can look at those beam paints as well. I do like these, but I don't find that I have a convenient way to put them in a palette. The other palettes I have either have these plastic little pans that fit snugly in the palettes. They're designed to be together, or I just squeeze the paint directly in the palette. When I've painted with these, I have to almost hold them individually as I paint with them, and I just haven't really embraced that idea. But the colors are really quite beautiful, and their environmental mission is really quite a lovely commitment. So again, we'll do some more. Wow, those are gorgeous. This is pretty light. This is just an iridescent silver. Again, these were a gift, and I have painted with them, but I just seem to keep going back to my favorites. I just thought I'd show you the more offbeat ones before I get to the ones I use all the time. So those are the beam paints. And then these wild paints here, let me show you. There's absolutely no control with this, and it's an explosion of color. So I keep these thumbtacks in them because I found that if I open them with their pop caps, that powder goes everywhere, and the powder is heavily pigmented and it gets into everything. So I found it easier to poke a hole. That was a suggestion by someone who taught me about these. Has a teeny little hole, and then I can just pepper down some of these and let them do their thing. I don't have to just let them do their thing. I could get in there with a brush and paint around. But I find that they do really interesting things on their own because they're really just little pepper specks of thick pigment. So really interesting. Put these away. And then these block paints, I can show you these as well. They are beautiful paints, and the quality of Daniel Smith and Winsor Newton is definitely professional grade. Like I said, though, I like the bigger wells, and these pans come in these small wells. So I'm just activating it with a wet brush and then painting. Of course, you don't have to go directly from pan to paper. You could bring color over to your mixing area and do it that way as well. And we'll talk about color mixing. So those are all the options I've outlined other than my tube paints. And those are the ones I really want to spend more time on. Once you've picked out which brand of colors you want and also which format the pan or the tube paints, then it comes down to picking the colors that you're going to put in your palette. And that can be a really overwhelming experience. It's easy to get seduced by all the colors in the store. Even if you narrow your scope down to basically one brand, which I use almost exclusively Daniel Smith. Occasionally somebody will tell me about a great color in another brand and I might try it, but I have found that I really have enough as it is and I don't need to go out and buy a lot of other brands' colors. Plus I feel like they play really well together when they're from within the same brand. But even within the Daniel Smith brand, I think there's more than 250 colors. So how do you decide? There's a lot of factors that can go into deciding which colors you should get. For years and years, I chose colors just by what thrilled me when I went to the store and saw them. And that was not a great plan. And then I finally decided I needed to have more of a structured plan in the colors I chose and in the layout of them in my palette. So some of the factors that you would consider when choosing your colors are the transparency, which means how transparent or opaque is it. Watercolors can come as transparent, opaque, or semi-transparent, semi-opaque. Some colors you will need and you will just have to resign yourself to having opaque colors. But transparent colors tend to really sing in watercolors and they also mix better with other colors. So I try to go with as many transparent watercolor choices as I can. When I'm looking at yellows, for example, there's a big variety of yellows I could buy. So I want to almost eliminate immediately the yellows that are just opaque, unless I have a real specific reason for needing a color. So transparency is my number one choice. But if I need a color that I can't really mix from the others and it's semi-opaque or opaque, then I'll go ahead and get it. The other factor is light fastness, and that refers to how many years can go by before that color starts to fade in a painting. And the best light fastness rating is 1. So as much as possible, I try to pick colors that are either a rating of 1 or 2. There are 5 ratings within Daniel Smith, and 5 is the one that fades the fastest. In fact, it's referred to as a fugitive. That said, I do have a couple of colors that are rated 5, and I have been painting for close to 40 years, and I have found that those haven't really faded. So I think that we're still in good shape. It's just that some people are really picky, that they only want to paint with light fastness of 1 or 2, and it's preferable. And then the other factor to consider is it a staining color or not? That's not something that really means much to me, but for some artists, depending on their favorite ways and techniques of painting, it's important to know if a color is a staining color. And what that means is that it won't lift off of your painting as easily as a non-staining color. Sometimes artists like to paint, let's say, an undercolor of yellow and then paint over it in red, and then lift out a little bit of that red so that the yellow shows through. For example, it can have beautiful effects. But if you chose a red that is a heavy stainer, you might not have that yellow show through. You might be able to lift out a little bit of red, and then it'll look more orangey when you lift out. Or also, sometimes we do make mistakes, and having colors that are non-staining allows you to lift them out more easily than staining colors. But like I said, I don't really paint with that lifting out technique in front of mind. And so if a color is more staining or not is not something that has really played into how I choose my colors. My suggestion would be to start off with a limited palette if you're new to watercolors. And with that, I would say you want to get a cool, a warm, and a neutral of each of your primaries. So the cool yellow that I have is Hansa Yellow Light, and that's the one that I filled up earlier. That is already too much pigment. That's how little paint you need in watercolor. So if I put that down, you can see that's really pretty thick. So it's not like painting with other mediums that you like to see a dollop of paint on your brush. With watercolor, you really don't need to see much. The challenging thing is when you first squeeze out paint into your palette, it's going to come up in a big dollop like that. It's hard to get just a little bit of paint. And this is my cool yellow. What I mean by cool is that as I look at a color, I'm thinking, does it lean more towards the greens and blues or more towards the oranges? And the temperature of a color is relative to the colors that surround it. So I'm calling this my cool yellow because the yellow next to it is already more orange. But if I had a yellow that had a little bit more green in it, then this could be my warm yellow. I don't want to turn this into a color theory class, but I'm just letting you know that the temperature of a color changes based on the colors that are next to it. I use Hansa Yellow Light as my cool yellow because of the colors I've chosen to put in my palette. My next color is my warm yellow, and it's warm because it's headed towards the oranges and reds. And that's why I've put it here, and this is New Gamboge. Notice because this is hard, it's easier to pick up just a little bit. You barely see any on the brush. So that's my New Gamboge, and you can see it leans more towards oranges and reds than that one. So this is my cool, this is my warm, and for my neutral yellow, I'm using yellow ochre, and I have that up here. I'll talk in a little bit about why they are in the positions that they are. So these are 3 primaries of yellow, going with cool, warm, and neutral. For my reds, I've chosen transparent pyrrole orange as my warm red, and it is right here. It does come across as an orange. It is technically an orange, but for my color palette, and the way I've organized my colors, I consider that my warm red. My cool red is quinacridone rose. And you might think, well, you're calling them reds, but one's orange and one's more on the pink side. But that's because these are in the red family and they mix better than a real red. For example, a real red would be cadmium red medium hue, which is right here. This is what we think of as a primary red. However, that's an opaque color and it's a really heavy color. So if I mix that with other colors, I don't get the better results that I get with these choices here. And I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. So that's my warm red, my cool red, and then as my neutral red, I use burnt sienna. Technically a brown, so I'm confusing you, but this brown is very red based and it's considered a neutral because it doesn't really lean towards cool or warm. With my blues, I have French ultramarine as my warm blue. That means that this blue has more of a red leaning on it than other blues. Absolutely love this blue. And for my cool blue, I'm using phthalo blue green shade. There is a phthalo blue red shade and it's very different. So if you're going with my palette, it has to be phthalo blue green shade. And this is a cool blue, cooler than that one. And for my neutral blue, I'm using indigo. I don't have white paint and I do not have black paint in my palette. I can use my indigo as my black. And for white, I use the white of the paper. White watercolor paint is very opaque and it lays down almost more like chalky water, like toothpaste water. And to really make your watercolors glow, it's better just leave the white of the paper. So this is the limited palette I would suggest you start out with. And here's a schematic diagram of how I lay those colors out in a color wheel. In the 12 o'clock position, I have my 2 yellows. In the 4 o'clock position, my 2 reds. In the 8 o'clock position, my 2 blues. Then you can see that I have my neutrals tucked away in those side pockets. The yellow ochre is up by my yellows. The burnt sienna is by my reds, and the indigo is by my blues. My goal is to set up my palette's colors in the same order as the color wheel. And so that's why you can see here the yellows at the 12 o'clock position, the reds at the 4 o'clock, and the blues at the 8 o'clock. All the empty wells between the primaries can be filled up as your paint collection grows. Here is my palette of my favorite 21 colors, and you can see I have them organized going incrementally from the coolest yellow to the warmest yellows, cool oranges, warm oranges, and so forth, all the way through the color wheel. This makes it so much easier for me to understand how to mix my colors. It's not easy to tell which color should go in which well to progress our way through the color wheel. For example, I will make swatches of all my colors, but sometimes just looking at 2 yellows, it's hard for me to discern which one has more of a cool temperature and which one is slightly warmer. Fortunately, most brands of watercolors offer charts of all their colors, and the charts are laid out in the correct sequence for us. I love to use my Daniel Smith chart to help me organize my colors. Well, I don't know which one would come first, but if I look at the Daniel Smith chart, it lays it out in the order. So when I laid out my colors, I laid them out in the order following Daniel Smith's recommendation, so that I know that these are incremental visual differences that go from one hue to the next hue. So I laid out all my tubes of paint and compared them to these charts from Daniel Smith. And I was able to lay out all of my tubes in the correct order. And even though Daniel Smith breaks out their Primatech colors and their luminescent colors in separate charts, I had enough of my paints organized that I could easily integrate any other colors I had from these two sets. So by using the color charts of any brand of paints you choose, you should be able to lay out your paints in your palette in the correct color wheel order. So once you've picked your paints, you've picked your palette, and you figured out the correct order to squeeze all of those paints into, now it's finally time to start playing with your colors and color mixing. Earlier I was saying, for example, why would I pick this as my cool red instead of that? And what I'm looking for are these basics to be the colors that I can mix the prettiest mixes with. If I'm only going to use 9 colors, I want to be sure that I can create the prettiest mixes. For example, if I want to make purple, I could use quinacridone rose and phthalo blue green shade. And let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to take quinacridone rose, make a little puddle here. Your puddles do not need to be big with watercolors. I think sometimes we get an exaggerated sense of how much water and paint we need. Notice this is just barely damp, and I just touch into it until I get it the darkness, the value that I want. So that's my quinacridone rose. Then I'm going to reach for some phthalo blue green shade, and I'm going to put a puddle right next to it. I want to mix these two colors to create a purple. So one of my mixing tips would be to start with the lightest color, which is a quinacridone rose, and just put a touch of the darker color into it. I rinse out my brush and I tap out the excess water. I don't want to keep adding water to my puddle or it'll just keep getting lighter and lighter. So I rinse this out, I tap it out on my towel to rinse it out and dry it off, and then I mix them together. And that's a pretty lovely purple. If you want it to be darker, you could add a little bit more of this blue to it. If that's too dark, you can go back to adding a little bit of this quinacridone rose to it. And you can keep playing back and forth with those until you get the shade you want. And again, to make them lighter in watercolor, we just add water. So you can see I'm getting much lighter versions of these. But what if instead of quinacridone rose, I chose cadmium red medium hue as my red? And again, I'm making a little puddle of that. And then I can go back to that phthalo blue green shade and make a little puddle of this. And now I'm going to rinse out my brush, tap out the excess water on my towel, pick up a little bit of this and mix it in. That is not a purple I want to paint with. If I add more blue to it, it just starts looking more gray. So this is an important thing to start to learn about your colors, is that even though we learn in school that red and blue make purple, the red you choose and the blue you choose will impact hugely the results you get. So the colors I chose as the 9 essential colors are colors I have found that when I mix them together, I get the best color mixes. To really get to know your colors, I recommend getting a sketchbook and dedicating it to your watercolor paints, to exploring how they mix together and their properties. This sketchbook that I'm showing you is the result of a workshop I teach called Understanding Colors for the Watercolorist. This workshop is completely dedicated to understanding our paints. It's nothing but color charts and color wheels and color recipes. It's a great way to learn all these different aspects of the colors you use in a sketchbook dedicated to just that learning, instead of trying to learn these properties in the middle of a painting. I really recommend that you get yourself a watercolor sketchbook and play with all kinds of charts and color mixing recipes. There are a lot of approaches to studying color theory, but nothing will get you more confident and comfortable with your paints than doing exercises like this. So I'd like to share a few of those exercises with you here. When it comes to mixing colors, there are several ways that we can mix colors with our watercolor paints. One is to mix our color on the paper, one is to mix our color in the palette, and one is to mix our color in layers. So I'm going to start with the idea of mixing our color in layers because I need to let these swatches dry and then come in and paint on top of them. So let's say here's one swatch of quinacridone rose. This is at a milky consistency. When I refer to the consistencies, I'm referring to what you see on the palette. See, I've added a lot of water. This starts having the consistency of weak tea. The idea of dragging my brush through this feels like that's probably what it would look like to drag my brush through weak tea. If I add a little bit more paint to it, it starts having more body to it and more color, and that starts being the consistency of milk. If I add even more color to it, it starts getting almost a little bit of resistance, a little on the palette. It starts being whole milk or a little bit more creamy. And you can see it keeps getting darker and darker. So that is a pretty creamy consistency. If I water it down, it starts having a milky consistency. And if I water it down even more, it's a weak tea consistency. So these are the values of the color. These are all the same color, right? They're all from my quinacridone rose. But by changing the water to paint ratio, I start getting different values, lightness to darkness. Okay, so when I'm doing these swatches, I'm talking about a milky consistency, somewhere in the middle, not too thick and not too watery. Let's do another swatch up here for our layering. I'm going to use different colors now than what I've already showed you. This is cobalt blue. I'll do a nice swatch of this. Notice I put down my brush and I just brush back and forth without picking up my brush and putting it down. Rinse out that brush, tap out that water, and let's pick another color. I have some mystery colors in my pockets up here. Let's see what this is. I put my main colors around the circle, and then I have my neutrals, my neutral yellow, my neutral red, and my neutral blue in the side pockets. All the other side pockets are paints that I just use occasionally, or somebody wanted me to try and they squoze a little bit in there for me. So these are 3 swatches I've done now. I don't know what this purple is. We could get a little bit darker on that. Another layer. And I'm going to let those dry so that then I can come in and layer more colors on top and show you how we mix using layers. While that's drying, let's look at the other ways of mixing color. The next way of mixing color is by mixing them on the palette. You saw me do the purples earlier, but I can do more colors now. Let's try mixing this color. I rarely use, it's burnt sienna light. And I need to add more water to that to get more. I haven't activated this in a long time, so I'm working a little bit harder at it. There we go. Rinse out my brush. Let's pick another color. Let's say yellow ochre. So these are my two colors. Notice these puddles are not much bigger than the size of a quarter. You don't have to make big puddles. They both have a milky consistency. Generally, it's a good idea to start with the light color and add some of the darker color into it. If I keep brush stroking that until it's a homogeneous color, that is mixing on the palette. So I've made my mixes here on the palette, and then I can come over here and see what I get. I can add even more of it. Again, mixing on the palette. So that's one way of mixing these two colors. Another way would be to mix on the paper. And I can create those puddles again so that I'm ready to paint. I have my puddles of paint at the right consistency, and I can pick that up, put some down, rinse out my brush, pick up the next one, and put it right in there. And I'm going to let them mix on the paper. What I don't want to do is keep brush stroking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Just drop it in and step away. With watercolors, the more you keep mixing and mixing and mixing, the more homogeneous it looks, but also it starts looking a little bit overworked or tired. It's better to just be very light with your mixes. Let's do some more. Since I have this quinacridone rose on the palette ready to go, we'll do that, and we'll add in this lovely quinacridone gold. Again, this is pretty dry, so I'm working a little bit harder at it. And I want a little bit more of this. Okay, so if I'm going to mix it on the palette, I'm going to take this and mix it. That's enough mixing. And come over here. Maybe add a little bit more quinacridone rose to it. So those are mixed on the palette. And if I want to mix them on the paper, I make my clean puddles. That's quin rose, yellow ochre. I can pick up that yellow ochre, pick up that quin rose, and let them mix on the paper. You'll get really different results. I find mixing on the paper much more exciting. There's something about letting the colors mingle without getting in there and brush stroking them that can create some pretty exciting and spontaneous mixes. When you want more control and having a uniform, homogeneous mix on the paper, then it's better to mix on your palette. I'm going to clean that up, and then we'll go back to those first swatches we did and do layering. Okay, now the 3 swatches I did earlier are completely dry, and this is the third way of mixing colors. Remember, the first way was mixing 2 colors on the palette and then painting with them, like we did here. And then the second way was of letting the colors mix on the paper. This third way is a layering process, which gives you a lot of control. The first layer needs to be completely dry before you paint a second layer on there. If you go in there with that second layer while these are still damp, then you're back to mixing color on the paper. This system of layering gives you a lot of control, whereas mixing on the paper does not. And that's one of the reasons we choose to mix on the paper, is to let the colors do their own blending and their own mixing and let a little bit of the control go in favor of more spontaneous and fresh looking mixes. But sometimes we really want to be able to control exactly what is going on with our color mixes. So we turn to layering. You paint your first layer, let it dry, and then come in with a second layer and paint on top. Let's say I'm going to paint, what color do I want to paint on top of my quinacridone rose? I think I'll do cobalt blue. I want a nice milky consistency, and I will come in and paint it on top. Because watercolor is a transparent medium, we can see the quinacridone rose coming through the cobalt blue. And that is one of the beautiful things about choosing colors that are more transparent than opaque. If you did this with oil or with acrylic, those are opaque mediums and the first layer would not show through. While in watercolor, it gives you this beautiful blending. It's a visual mixing. So for that second swatch, I had cobalt blue down. Let's add something else. Let's add a green to it. And again, I want something that is somewhat of a milky consistency. This is undersea green, and I'll paint it on top. And you can see this beautiful mix that I'm getting. You can always go in while it's still wet and drop in some more. You can do that while it's still wet, but once it starts to dry, try to refrain from going back in. If you do, you might start creating what's called blossoms, which is these irregularities from dropping in too much water when the layer had started to dry. So it's better to just do it once while it's wet and then get out. For our last swatch, which was purple, I'll go ahead and come in here and add Prussian blue. Nice consistency, not too thick. And you could do many, many layers. You could let this completely dry, and if you decided, no, I need this to be more towards pink, or I need this to be more towards purple, you could do another layer that way and build up your colors in this way. So I would suggest practicing a little bit with the 3 different ways of mixing colors. Mixing on the paper, mixing on the palette, and layering. Another thing I recommend is that if getting the right color is important to you, doing these kind of swatches like I've been doing throughout this lesson is a great way to test before you commit to doing it on your painting. So if you've made a mix and it's on your palette, but you're not sure it's the right purple, before you paint it onto your painting, paint it onto some scrap paper to see if you're getting the color you want. That can save you a lot of grief down the road. So one fun idea for color mixing and learning how to do this is pick 2 random colors. I'm going to pick back to quinacridone rose. And it's a milky consistency. You can see that it's not very light. It's not too watery. And then I'm going to start mixing it with Hansa Yellow Light. And I'm going to start, even though I told you earlier you go from the light colors and you add in the dark, for this particular exercise, we're going to go against that rule. I'm going to add just a little bit of Hansa Yellow Light to that puddle. And this is what I get. And then what if I add a little bit more Hansa Yellow Light? I think I need more than that. It's amazing, and I think really exciting to see the mixes you can get from even just 2 colors as you play with the ratio of one color to the next, and then play with the ratio of how much water is in there. And let's do the last one. Just straight Hansa Yellow Light. Need a little more color. So for this, I have straight quinacridone rose with a little bit of Hansa Yellow Light, more Hansa Yellow Light, more Hansa Yellow Light, and then just Hansa Yellow Light here. It's such a great way to explore what you can get out of those 2 colors. Then you can also explore those same exact colors, but watered down. Watered down considerably. And I get that. And then I can add in a little bit of Hansa Yellow Light, add in a little bit more of Hansa Yellow Light, even more, and then very watery Hansa Yellow Light. So now what I'm playing with is color mixing and also color values, just adding water to them. And you could do this with so many colors in your palette. Just pick any two colors and play with mixing them from one pure color to the other pure color, and play with watering those mixes down. When it comes to choosing colors for a painting, we also want to think about what colors look good together. In other words, what colors give us color harmony. You can get into a lot of danger if you throw all the colors you have into a painting. It's much better to work with a limited palette. Just pick a few colors. You ensure that you have color harmony when you do that. Another way to ensure that you have color harmony is to work with analogous colors. That means colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel. Colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel always look good together. And for a little excitement, it's nice to put a pop of the complementary color. The complement of yellow is purple. The complement of red is green. The complement of blue is orange. So if I choose to do a few analogous colors, let's say in the yellow to orange family, I could paint New Gamboge. Let's get a little thicker. Do a little New Gamboge. Then pick some yellows and oranges that are close to it on the color wheel. Get into the beautiful quinacridone gold. Let me skip one color, but I'm still sticking with the oranges. So here I'm getting into quinacridone burnt orange. So here I have 3 analogous colors, and I can put a pop of the complementary. So let's say these are my oranges. The complementary of orange is blue. So I could come over here and just pick up some of this cobalt blue. And this is a really lovely palette. Those colors complement each other really well. And you can also play with mixing these colors together. If I stick to just these 4 colors in a painting and I mix them with each other to different degrees of ratios, and then I also mix in different degrees of water to paint, I can end up with dozens and dozens of color combinations. For example, I can take that cobalt blue and mix it with that New Gamboge, and now I have a green. But that green has beautiful color harmony with these 4 colors because it's made from these. You can make so many colors with just these. What if I then add this to this and I get another green? I'm starting to go towards the brown. And I'm just mixing colors that are in this family, and I can start making them more watery. And this is a fun way to start filling up the pages of your color sketchbook too. Label your colors and then look at all the variations you can create with just those. You'll quickly come to find which colors you love to work with and which colors have a lot of color harmony together. Color theory is a really complicated topic, so I don't want to take us in that direction for this initial introduction to colors. But I want you to start playing and be a little bit bold with your swatches. It's easy to fall in love with color and how colors mix together once you get going in this direction. You'll also find that some colors are not very appealing together, and that's good to know too. Better to learn that creating these little swatches than to figure that out in the middle of a painting. One last tip on color mixing. If I'm trying to get a specific color, and like here I've mixed 2 colors, if I'm not getting the color I want, I might come in and add a 3rd color to the mix, right? So here I'm using my cobalt blue and the burnt orange that I was using earlier. And I might decide that's not exactly what I want. Let me try adding a 3rd color to it. And I pick up some of that yellow mix. That can also look really beautiful in here. However, if I don't get the color I want after mixing 3 paints together, I start all over. I find that if I start adding in a fourth color or a fifth color, the colors start getting really muted and really muddy. They start going towards these browns and grays that can be really unappealing. So my suggestion is don't use more than 3 paints in any one color mix. Here are some of the swatches we created. I'm going to encourage you to really let yourself play with these. If you don't have scraps of watercolor paper like I do, get a watercolor sketchbook that you can do this in. Be sure to use decent watercolor paper. If you use the really cheap student grade paper, you're not going to get great results, and you're going to think it's your color mixing that's the problem, when in reality it might be the paper you're using. You can also use the backs of old paintings that you don't like to do these on. Oftentimes, if I painted something and I didn't like the way it turned out, instead of just tossing it, I'll cut it up into these strips, and then I can do more and more swatching. Enjoy your color. I hope you found this basics of watercolor paint tutorial useful, and as always, thank you for joining me.